Welcome to another episode of the AI-driven Swebbcast. The source content is all Swebb, but the interpretation and presentation is all AI.
Ever wonder how Swebb approaches, like, church budgets? It's definitely not your average bean counting session.
Right. Like, spreadsheets in churches don't exactly scream excitement.
Exactly. But get this, we got our hands on this internal document. It basically lays out Swebb's entire philosophy on budgeting. And let me tell you, it's packed with some pretty unexpected ideas.
Yeah, it's wild. Like, the whole thing is less about crunching numbers and more about using the budget as a tool to, like, shape the future.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So instead of just looking at last year's spending and tweaking things a bit, they're being more proactive with it.
Totally. They even have this line in the document, budget is theory and hopes, not promised money.
Whoa, that's deep. So how do they actually translate that big vision into a real budget?
Well, that's where the whole idea of leverage comes in. Another quote that really stood out to me was, budgets don't make money, they help us leverage money.
Leverage, okay. So, like, making the most of what you've got, right? I mean, we've all been there. Whether it's, like, our personal finances or a project at work, there's always that struggle to stretch those resources. But how does that actually work in a church setting?
Well, this is where things get a little controversial. Swebb actually argues that budgeting is, well, it's never really fair.
Hold up. Intentional unfairness. Isn't fairness, like, kind of a big deal, especially in a church?
Sure, fairness is important, but Swebb's point is that aiming for, like, perfect equality across the board can actually stifle progress. Think about it. If you spread resources equally among all departments, regardless of what they're actually doing, it might feel fair on the surface, but would it really have the biggest impact overall?
So it's more about being strategic, right? Like, instead of spreading the butter evenly, you're saying Swebb wants to maybe pile it on a little thicker in certain areas.
Exactly. And to organize this whole strategic piling thing, they actually have 3 main spending categories they call buckets.
Buckets. Okay, I like it. Keeps things simple. What are the buckets?
So there's ministries, which focuses on, people, the congregation. Then there's central, which covers all the general church expenses, things like building maintenance, utilities, that sort of stuff. And lastly, there's personnel and admin, which, like, supports everything else, the behind-the-scenes folks.
Okay, 3 buckets, pretty standard stuff. But what I found really interesting is that these buckets don't necessarily line up with the typical organizational chart. Most organizations just kind of, like, mirror their budget with their existing departments, right?
Yeah, that's the usual way to do it. But Swebb takes a different approach. These 3 buckets represent a real shift away from those, like, traditional silos.
So it's less about, like, which department is running a program and more about what that program is actually trying to achieve.
Precisely. For example, you might have a youth outreach program, right? Instead of just funding it through the ministries bucket, they might also pull some funds from central, maybe even personnel and admin, depending on what the program needs to really succeed. It just highlights how important that program is to their overall vision.
So it's all about, like, flexibility and really targeting those investments. Makes sense. But how does all of this actually work in practice? Like, how do staff actually engage with this unique budgeting system?
Well, the document actually lays out 4 specific steps for staff to follow when submitting budget requests. First, they have to really, identify their needs. And not just for the next year, they have to think long term.
So it's not just about throwing some random numbers on a page. There's some real thought behind it.
Absolutely. They have to, like, clearly justify every request, explain why those resources are crucial for achieving the church's vision. And then step 3 is where things get collaborative.
Well, I love collaboration.
Right. So they're encouraged to connect with other teams, see if there are any overlaps in their needs, and, identify opportunities to share resources.
That's brilliant. It reminds me of that time I was, like, frantically trying to find props for a Sunday school play. Turns out there's a whole treasure trove of costumes and decorations just gathering dust in the basement. Sometimes being resourceful is just about remembering what you already have.
Totally. And the document actually gives some specific examples of this, like checking if the IT department has equipment you can borrow instead of buying new stuff or reusing decorations from, like, past events.
It's all about being smart and making the most of what you've got. What about step 4? What's the final step in the process?
Step 4 is all about being ready to adapt. Needs change, priorities shift, and staff have to be flexible, willing to adjust their plans based on the feedback they get and the resources that are actually available.
So it's an ongoing conversation, not just a one-time budget submission and then everyone just forgets about it.
Yeah, exactly. And then once the budget is actually set, there's a huge emphasis on, responsible spending, transparency, and accountability. The document talks about the importance of tracking expenses carefully, getting approval for any large purchases, and, ideally moving toward a more real-time accounting system.
Okay, so it's really about making sure every dollar is being used intentionally and effectively. Now, even though we're diving deep into church budgets here, are there any, like, broader lessons here? Something anyone who wants to be more intentional with their resources can take away?
Absolutely. We can all benefit from thinking about our budgets as, a plan for the future we want to create, not just a record of the past. Swebb really challenges us to think critically about where we want to go and then allocate our resources accordingly. And sometimes that means being a little less focused on, perfect fairness and more focused on making the biggest impact.
It's like investing strategically in the future you want.
Exactly. And this brings up a big question for all of us. Are we being intentional enough with our own resources? Are we using what we have to actually achieve our goals?
That's something to think about. So whether it's your personal budget or your work budget, take a look at your own spending and ask yourself, could you be leveraging your resources more effectively? Could you be doing more with what you've got to actually get where you want to go? Definitely something to consider.
Are you going to do something with what you just heard? Or are you just trying to be entertained? Share this episode, then connect with Swebb. Bring him to your headquarters or visit him in Austin, Texas. Swebb is a productive disruptor for leaders and teams in churches and marketplace organizations. His goal is to make you better first, make you a friend later. Swebb serves leaders and executive teams around the world, primarily focused on helping organizations maximize what they say they want to do. He drives you to execute on your expectations, even if it hurts your ego. He's not here to please everyone, nor does he seek validation. But if you're serious about elevating your leadership and team performance, you'll know where to find him. Connect with Swebb at swebb.fyi or on Instagram at swebbfyi. You doing all you said you'd do, that's what the church and the world needs.